Lori Ford. Unfortunately, my name is not showing up on the name list, but I am here. I just logged in as Robin on accident. So there's two Robins. She had to cleave herself and make herself into two because she's that important. I just want to let everybody know, just a reminder, everybody is on mute so that we don't get too many distractions. I'm actually going to put myself on mute so you won't have to listen to my dogs bark. And Kim Mason will be doing the talking. The content for today is mostly going to be on working with families with mental health issues. This was a topic at the symposium. However, Kim has lots of experience with different mental health issues, so she's going to hopefully kind of broaden the symposium topic. We were going to talk a little bit about families of divorce, but there's actually another webinar on that. I think in August, Kim was saying, so there won't be as much information. It'll just kind of be touched on today, and then we'll focus mostly on families with mental health issues. As a reminder, because you're on mute, the way to get your questions out there is make sure you're typing them in. I will be watching questions as we go along. Be sure to ask a lot of questions. We had this webinar I think at the end of last year, and so we want to make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs with the webinar. It's a very popular topic, so we definitely wanted to do it again, but your questions make it a richer experience. So please ask questions, type them in, and I will save them up. And Kim pauses a lot to ask for questions, so we'll get a chance to ask your questions. Just be sure and type them in. And if you're having any problems, also type those in so that I can give those to the other Robin because she's better at helping with the IT stuff. So between all three of us, we should get all the needs met for today. And anything else, Kim? Should we get started?
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We may have some people joining us as we go along, so we may have to stop and just remind people. But good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased that you guys were able to take part in this. We really wanted to do this so that people that weren't able to go to the symposium or the supervisors who weren't able to be in on this part of the symposium were able to still get the information that was presented there. I did double check while Lori was talking. We are doing the webinar on divorced and separating families in July. And in October, we are actually doing a full webinar on working with kids and family members who are in the autism spectrum. So we will be addressing those topics more in depth, but hopefully we can give some general information. Some of you, if you've attended the mental health webinar before, this is going to look very, very familiar. That webinar didn't record, and this one is being recorded so that more people can get the information. Please ask questions as we go along. If we don't understand the question as you type it in, or if you just want to type in, I have a question, and it takes you a little longer to type in, then Lori will, alert me that we have a question coming. So I think that's all the kind of logistical issues, and I will try to talk slow. Those of you who've been in training with me know that that is really, really difficult for me, but I'll try to slow it down as we go along. So Kelly Army actually is the one who presented at the symposium on this topic, but she used a lot of the same slides that I did. And at the symposium, we were lucky enough to have a therapist there who had just recently had a very successful case that closed out with a mother, I believe, who was diagnosed borderline personality disorder. And so they spent a lot of time at the symposium talking about the work she did with that specific case. We're going to try to do some more general things on this webinar, but also talk about a specific case that I'm familiar with as we go along. So just some general facts. 30 to 50% of children whose parents are mentally ill develop mental health issues compared to 20% of children in the general population. Mental health issues of parents impact 1 out of 4 families in the U.S. And I think a really important thing to remember is that 70% of the parents who suffer from mental illness have lost custody of their kids at some point, and that parents who suffer from depression are less likely to interact with their kids, which results in decreased stimulation for the kids. So a lot of times you'll see that these kids tend to lag behind in language development, emotional behavior, and maturity. Okay, so one of the things I think is the most important thing that we get asked a lot regarding working with families where there are mental health issues is kind of this idea, how can we actually have impact with some of these families? And I think the most important thing to remember, and demonstrated by this slide, is you have the problem behavior. And certainly we are going to address that problem behavior. It doesn't mean we're going to change the fact maybe that somebody's schizophrenic or that somebody has a diagnosis of borderline personality behaviors. But what we believe in FFT is that by looking at what happens within the family, the behavior patterns, and how that meets relational function, so how people surround themselves around the problem behavior can make the behaviors worse or better. And so during the motivation phase, we're going to focus on understanding the family story, understanding their relational patterns, and then we're going to utilize that information in behavior change and generalization to address the problem behaviors. Once again, we aren't going to change the fact that somebody has this diagnosis. We aren't going to change the fact that a kid is high-functioning autistic, but we can impact the way that they deal with it and the way they interact with their family members, and most importantly, the way the entire family organizes itself around the problem behaviors. So once again, engagement and motivation, we're assessing, we're determining relational patterns, and then in behavior change and generalization, we're going to focus in on the problem behaviors using all that information that we've gained and assessed in motivation. Any questions so far, Lori?
So far, no questions.
Okay, all right. So one of the case examples I want to use is a referral that was actually made from a child welfare organization. And the referral was made for mom, a stepdad, and 2 youth because of a high level of family conflict. And so the initial session was supposed to be the therapist, the child welfare case manager, and the parents and kids. But the parents came without the kids. And they expressed concern over the kids being in the session because they had such a high degree of marital conflict as well. And so what a lot of times people do is go, oh, well, then we just need to do, marriage therapy with this family. But in reality, the case manager and therapist both saw that a lot of the problems the kid was having at school and in the community was impacted by the parents' problems and the way they kind of organized around that. And so first thing that he did was he pointed out the strength of the parents wanting to protect their kids, but he also pointed out that since there were so many difficulties in the school and community and child welfare had got involved, that it was really important that we try to address this as a family issue and then possibly look at marital counseling for the parents after we had got some of the family issues resolved. And they were able to agree on that. So I think the most important thing to remember about this is that everybody's always going to be looking for reasons not to do family therapy. We have to look for the reasons to do it. And we have to remember that we have the goal of kind of helping this family function in a better way, not taking away the diagnosis when we're working with the mental health issue. So one of the things that happened with this case was between the initial meeting and the first actual session, the stepdad called the therapist up and he used the exact line, there are some things that you need to know. Now, whenever a family tells you that, you want to be really on guard, because generally it means they want to give you secrets. So I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. One, secrets don't do us any good. We can't use them unless we get permission from whoever's giving us the secret. We also need to make sure we remind people of our mandated reporter status so that we don't get secrets that we ultimately have to report. And so one of the things that he said is, okay, but if whatever you're telling me, I want to be able to talk about in the family therapy session. And if we're not able to talk about it, I'm not sure that I need to know at this point. And so the stepdad agreed, and then he informed the therapist that his wife was diagnosed borderline and has had multiple affairs on him, and that he was really angry about this, and this was the source of their marital problems. So once again, the therapist had to look, kind of change Dad's focus as this kind of negative thing of kind of telling on his wife, and change it to he's really wanting to help his family. And that the fact that he was willing to stay in with this through all of these difficulties shows how committed he is to the family. So after all that, Dad goes, oh yeah, I'm in individual therapy and I've been told I'm codependent. And the therapist said he wanted to go, really? I wouldn't have guessed that. But he didn't. He stayed very strength-based, and he said, well, thank you. I appreciate the fact that, once again, you're wanting to share all this information so that we can help your family. So remember, you may hear a high degree of self-blame, shame, and negativity in families where there's a mental health issue. They have been told by so many people what they do wrong. They've been told by very few people what they do right. And what also can happen is the diagnosis can become the family. And so it's almost like they only see their family in terms of the fact that they have somebody who's depressed, or they have somebody who's schizophrenic or autistic. They kind of have lost that sense of a family outside of what they see as the problem. You may see either an over-reliance on the system or a great deal of reluctance to believe that therapy can work. Sometimes they have an over-reliance on the system just because, basically the system builds some dependence in on it, or they've tried so many things that really haven't worked that it's just like, why should I try again? And so part of motivation is really going to be motivating them to try again. You have to go be able to listen during the engagement phase and utilize this information to match to the family. Listen for whether they are dependent on the system and so they're looking for you to fix things. Or are they believing this just won't work, but somebody told them they had to do it and they're just going to do it. And also remember, one of the most important things is you may need to increase your frequency of sessions during the beginning of therapy in order to kind of help them overcome this history of negativity, blaming, and shame. Any questions so far?
It looks like you're doing a fabulous job. No questions yet. And just a reminder to people, feel free if you have any thoughts or even client situations that might fit, you can always ask. We don't want to get too client specific, but this is just an opportunity to enrich the experience. So feel free to ask questions as you go along.
So one of the things that we actually had a discussion group on the same topic at the National Blueprints Conference and the pre-conference for FFT. And one of the things that kept coming up is what diagnosis would exclude somebody from FFT? And we said, you can't say that, because even when somebody gets a diagnosis, their degree of functioning can be so varied that it really takes your clinical assessment to determine. I had a mother who was diagnosed bipolar. And I mean, that diagnosis didn't worry me at all. We had so many families that we'd worked with who was bipolar. And when I got out there, this mom, to me, honestly, she had been diagnosed by one of the best psychiatrists in our area. I thought she was schizophrenic. Now, I had to trust his diagnosis regardless, but she was extremely low functioning. And it may have been that there was low cognitive functioning before the mental health issue. Her mental health issue was actually the result of a pretty severe postpartum depression. And so it was even worse for the family because they remembered when she was, quote, unquote, normal. And now she was, I mean, to the point that she took cat food, formed it into a meatloaf, and fed it to her children for dinner. I mean, that kind of low-functioning mental health issue. So when I got out there, you know, number one, I had to kind of assess if I thought that we could be successful in FFT, and remembering that FFT is not one of those therapies where people have to have that aha moment of self-awareness of why they do what they do. What we need is that aha moment that we can do something differently and we're willing to work together. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get there with this family. But honestly, it wasn't because of Mom. It was because I really screwed up my alliance with the kid. And so, I mean, Mom's sitting there kind of ranting and raving and all this stuff is going on. And I turn to the kid and I say, so what do you think is the problem? And he looked at me like, honey, if you can't figure that out, you're not going to be able to help me. And he walked out, and I was never able to get him back into the session. So I think also we have to remember that when the mental health issue has become such a part of the family, don't shy away from putting it out there. I think if I would have said, so Mom, your depression has really impacted your ability to interact with your family, and it has caused a problem for you and for them, I think I would have been able to keep that kid. But by me acting like I wasn't noticing Mom's rather bizarre behavior in the session, I think he just thought, nah, this isn't going to work. So I think we have to be brave enough to address it. I think we have to be able to look for the strength in what they do, but also recognize the problems, the problem behaviors that come from some of it. Remember, in motivation, what we're really trying to do is create a new meaning for the problem for the family. If they simply see the problem as in the case example I used before, if we let Dad say what the problem is, Mom's borderline, there's no changing the fact that she's borderline. But if we can help them to see that some of the things that they do, all of the family members do, and that Mom does as well, make the situation between them worse, and some of the things make them better, and really help focus on the idea that there are things that can help them function better regardless of Mom's diagnosis, then we've created this context for change that allows us to move into behavior change. And by doing that, we decrease conflict, we increase hope for the future. And I think it's really important to remember balanced alliance. The stepdad wanted therapist on his side. And therapist had to make sure that he didn't take Dad's side, but that he also didn't alienate Dad as well. The way that we meet those goals is through our change focus and our change meaning technique. We change focus through point processing, sequencing, interrupting, diverting, and then we change meaning through our reframes and our themes that we use. And I think most importantly, remembering reframes and themes both talk about the bad component. They talk about the negative thing that is happening and then offer possible new meaning or new insight into that. We're focused on being strengths-based, relational, non-judgmental, and respectful. But being strengths-based does not mean not acknowledging the problem. We have to acknowledge the problem. And the skills, as a therapist, it takes is the interpersonal skills, the clinical skills, the ability to be contingent. You know, one of the ways that I really screwed up with that family I was just talking about with the mom who was so low functioning with her mental health issue is I was going in thinking I was getting one thing, and I didn't think quick enough on my feet in order to be able to really work with what I had. And then we have to be responsive to the family. So in the first session of the case example that I used, Mom called the therapist right as he was supposed to go for the first session and said she had to cancel because she and Dad had had a fight and Dad had left the home. Fortunately, Dad returned while she was on the phone with the therapist, who then was able to kind of convince them that going on with the session was really the thing they needed to do. And I think this happens with families whether there's a mental health issue or not. They call you and they say, well, things are just so bad right now, I need to cancel. And I think that's when we really need to push them that no, 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 no. If things are that bad, we really need to meet. And that was basically, he was pushing, before Dad came home even, to go out there and meet with Mom and the kids just because things were so intense at that point. So instead of kind of going, oh, okay, we'll meet tomorrow, he really pushed him, no, we need to meet today. And so he was able to get out there. The fight between the mom and the dad continued during the session. And what was actually, as much as he tried to interrupt and divert and point process and sequence, all of those things, he was able to see that during the fighting, the kids seemingly disappeared. They were in the room, but there was no interaction from them with the parents. There was no interaction from the parents towards them. And it was almost just like they were there and breathing, but that was it. And what happened was the therapist realized that he focused so much on the mom and dad's fighting that he really became a part of the pattern of ignoring the kids without realizing it. And so in the next session, he had to go in and work really hard to make sure that he worked on giving the kids some voice and helping them to kind of express their concerns. Now, on the other hand, I want you to remember that it is okay to focus your energy on the people who are most negative and blaming. But be aware that you may become part of the pattern, and you'll have to address that in future sessions. So it was okay for him to focus on mom and dad because they were the one most negative and blaming. But we want to make sure that every session doesn't result in the kids kind of sitting there, because then, of course, the kids are not motivated for therapy because it's the same as when you're not there. So the next session he went in, he really focused more on getting the kids, like I said, kind of giving the kids a voice and making sure that they got their needs heard. But remember, as a therapist, you really can become a part of the family pattern. I'm going to pause now and see if there's any questions.
No questions. And remember also, oh, somebody has a question. So I was just going to say, just write that you have a question. And Nicole is getting ready to write her question now. So I wonder if I should unmute Nicole and just let her ask? Okay. What about a parent who is severely depressed but won't talk about it? They're just kind of really shut down, or there's stuff going on and you can see it, but the parent isn't talking about it, especially depression.
I think number one, there's two things here. One is the rest of the family talking about it. Because if they are, then you can talk about it in terms of, talking to them and the impact and their concerns. But I think that's the other thing about kind of being brave and saying, Mom, here's what I noticed. And I wonder, have you ever struggled with depression before? Have you ever been diagnosed with depression? How long has this kind of, whatever it is you're seeing, being lethargic or not having the energy to do things, that kind of thing, how long has this been going on? So you may have to do some assessment. And it's also okay to go ahead and get an evaluation for depression at that point, especially if you think it's fairly severe. What you don't want, though, is you don't want to have it like, oh, we'll get you assessed for depression, get you on medication, and everything will be okay. So we want to talk about the impact it has on the family, whether or not they ever go get assessed, whether or not they get the medication. And we certainly don't want to kind of give the impression that medication is going to solve everything. Hopefully that answered the question. You have to put it out there. You have to point process it, sequence it.
It looks like it, and yeah, and then the question of referral, which you answered before I even asked it, so I thank you for the full gamut of that. And just to let people know, we're focusing right now on those first sessions, so we're doing engagement motivation, and we definitely will be talking about interventions in a few moments. There's also a question about domestic violence, which can happen when there's some mental health issues in the home. Can you speak to that a little bit in the engagement motivation piece, as well as, therapist safety?
Once again, I think that domestic violence is one of those things that you have the known and the unknown. And so you have where it's already reported, it's out there on the table that it's an issue, and I think you need to do a safety plan. I think the other thing to keep in mind is from the FFT standpoint, there's nothing that says we cannot do FFT with families where there's domestic violence. In fact, many of our agencies do. There are some agencies, however, that have their own policies that say that you cannot work with these families. That's your agency policy, not an FFT policy. Safety planning is a part of FFT, whether it be for suicidal ideation, whether it be for domestic violence, but developing a safety plan with a family where you know these things are going is a very important part of the engagement in the motivation phase. So I think that's the main thing. On the domestic violence, it is really about what your agency policy is, what they require you to do, and then from the FFT perspective, making sure you address the safety concern, and then making sure you don't just focus on the perpetrator of the domestic violence as being the evil one, remembering that that is one of those referred behaviors. The family does things that make it better, they do things that make it worse. Not saying that they cause or they deserve it. I'm not saying that at all, but what I'm saying is sometimes the domestic violence also is the result of not being able to communicate, not being able to problem solve, anger management issues. Does that answer that, Lori?
Yep, you got it great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So in the motivation phase for this particular case example, after the first session, the FSR showed really good alliance with mom and dad, but little alliance with the kids. The family had little hope. And what we realized is he really had to shift this from a parent focus to a family focus, using the idea that the parents fighting leads the kids to feel powerless and not having a place in the family. Well, what mom and dad really want is for everyone to feel like that they belong. We also had to really shift dad's focus from it's all mom's fault to they're all in this together. Notice we didn't try to give him new meaning to what she had done or to her affairs or anything like that, but just that, they were willing to work together. And then we really had to shift some of mom's focus from herself, which is, kind of classic borderline, to be pretty self-focused, to her family. So being able to kind of balance out getting her own needs met, but also meeting the needs of her family. So in the second session, the therapist started the session with the focus on a positive activity the family had been involved in when he arrived. And then he went into this idea that the parents fighting was they're not giving up on the family, but that the kids seemed to get lost when they fought. So it was kind of like, you fight because this is so important to you. And what happened from that is the parents started arguing. And the kids said, well, here we go again. And Dad said, oh, see, you always take your mom's side. So what was good then is the therapist was able to point out that it was really this kid's way of trying to stop the argument. It wasn't her taking mom's side. It was her feeling of powerlessness and feeling like she wasn't a part. And the youth agreed and said, that's it exactly. We try to stop this. We try to get them to do something different, but they won't listen to us. And it really led to a good discussion of how things are often not perceived the way that family members intended it. So once again, kind of helping them to get some new meaning to some of the behaviors that were happening. So what if the reframes and themes don't work, though? You've got to take responsibility. Don't just say this is a family that says it's not going to work, the FFT is not going to work, or that, well, mom is just, her mental health issue is just that she's not going to understand this. We've got to find reframes and themes that fit. But also go back to diverting and interrupting. You know, this therapist, he got them on reframes and themes, and then they go right back to fighting. Make sure you ask sequencing rather than blame-inducing questions. Make sure you ask strength-based questions if you're going to ask questions. Develop some new reframes and themes, and be more relentless with your reframing than they are with their blaming and their hopelessness. Remember, when working with anyone with mental health issues, that we are looking at behaviors and how these behaviors impact family members. What functions do the behaviors achieve? So my son, who is high-functioning autistic, most people would assume because he has that autism diagnosis that he would be autonomous to everyone. He is highly connected to me. He is autonomous to almost everybody else, but he's highly connected to me and his brother. And so he will do disruptive kind of behavior to get our connection, even if it's a negative connection. He will do that. So in session, when family members are doing kind of disruptive behavior, especially when there's a mental health issue, what function does it serve? What is the possible noble intent? And one of the things that one of the consultants brought up is that, and this is a consultant who worked in an outpatient mental health agency doing FFT, and he always started the session when there was these mental health issues with, what does it mean to you to be depressed, or the parent of a depressed child, which really allows you to kind of gain information on their understanding of the diagnosis, what they attribute it to, and then find ways to match to the family and what you may need to shift focus and change meaning. If they have a good understanding of the depression, they don't blame it for everything, that may just be mute. You just go into the behaviors. But if they're a family that blames everything on the fact that the kid is depressed, or they use that as kind of almost an excuse for things, then you know you're going to have to give some new meaning to that. You're going to have to be able to put that negative part of it out on the table. Any questions?
No questions, but I wanted to highlight something that you actually had said in the last slide, and it follows here, but being more relentless in your reframing and your behaviors as a clinician, that it is going to impact that hopelessness and blaming. You know, the importance of that, being more relentless than they are.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anybody needs any more information, but I think that's such a powerful statement, because across the board, regardless of the referral behaviors, I think that's hard, of being more relentless than they are with their I don't care, or, you know, I'm not going to stop smoking weed, or their, you know, so yeah. I don't know if there's more to give to that.
I think one thing that I always find funny, and if we laugh at ourselves, I think it's really helpful. But, you know, we always tell parents, don't think you can just tell a kid something once and they're going to remember it. And yet as therapists, we think we can reframe once, or we can do a theme once, and that the family's automatically going to jump up and down and go, that's it, that's it. You may say the same reframe or theme 50 different times in 50 different ways, but basically the same one, before you get the family to go, okay, maybe. Some families will. They'll jump right on board and you're okay. Other families, it's going to take longer to get there. And you may have to go around it. It doesn't mean you're a bad therapist. It doesn't mean you're not doing the model correctly. It's that relentlessness piece of finding a way that they can actually hear it. And sometimes it's simply repeating it multiple times before they actually listen and get it. Okay, I just saw that. Thanks. Yeah, I forget it all the time, too. I mean, I think we just have to remind ourselves that, you know, it really isn't about having 50 different reframes or themes. It's usually 2 or 3 that you say in 50 different ways for some families. For things for therapists to keep in mind. Now, exactly. This is for the, I'm sorry, what?
The other thing that I've noticed in that conversation is that you might say it 50 different times, and then the family comes back and tells you what you've been
Yeah.
telling them all along like it's news, and you're like, wow, that's brilliant. I wish I would have thought of that. You know, we just kind of keep going.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, Lori, because this is another point I'd like to make, especially those of you who've been in a training series with me. There is always at least one therapist who comes up to me at the third follow-up and says, wow, I wish you would have told me that at the first follow-up. And I'm like, I did. It's the same slide. And they're like, no, you never said that before. The same thing happens to families where all of a sudden the light bulb just goes on. And they don't remember you've ever said it before, even though you've said it. And so I think remember your own kind of learning and understanding, whether it's FFT or whether it's anything, parenting, for example. I mean, there were things that, you know, I knew or I thought I knew as a parent, and then when somebody would say something different, I would be like, oh, yeah. Well, I am sure that somewhere along the line I had learned that, but it didn't make sense till I was right there in the middle of it, and then it was kind of like that aha moment. Now, I think the next slide about things the therapist has to keep in mind, this is another part of that matching to that is so important. So many times as therapists, we try to go in, and one of the things we try to do with families is we try to normalize their behavior, or normalize a kid's behavior, or normalize a parent's behavior, whatever it may be. In some families, that's okay. But now let's keep in mind, and this isn't every borderline client, but the majority of borderline clients, remember, they like to think they're unique. No one in the world is like them. So if you try to normalize their behavior, it actually is going to hurt your alliance with them. And so what I had to have this therapist do is not go in and say to mom, every mom struggles with that. He had to go in and say things like, you know, you have some particular struggles that other people just don't have. And so it was actually like recognizing the fact that she sees herself as unique helped him to build the alliance. The reality was, yeah, it's the kind of things that everyone struggles with. But that wouldn't have matched her. It wouldn't have been something that she would have found motivating at all because she wanted to be highly unique. Also, with a borderline client in particular, you have to set firm boundaries around when they can call and what is appropriate to call about. I worked with one colleague who had a mom who'd been diagnosed borderline who called him on Christmas Eve to tell him that she was out of eggs. Okay? Not an appropriate call, okay? But those are the kind of things you want to set up. I always used to tell, especially if it was a known diagnosis, I used to, in the first session, say, at some point during this process, you're going to want to fire me. What I hope you will do is call and we'll talk about that, because I can guarantee at some point you're going to want to fire me, because we know that that is another pattern or trend we tend to see. With a depressed, where there's a known diagnosis of depression, I said there are going to be times when you feel like not having this session. That is absolutely when we need to have a session. And so just kind of setting that up and recognize it can be a match to from the very beginning. Don't fail to recognize the influence of the person who has been diagnosed. They can have a lot of power and influence in the family. They can shut the process down a lot of times. Even with depression, where they seem really lethargic, they can really kind of keep the process from moving forward. So you have to make sure that you look and you assess the kind of influence they have. And don't try to get caught up in trying to make them see logic. This would be really with any family. Or find out the truth. Look for the pattern. So many families, they want to tell you, oh, no, that's not the truth. He's lying to you. Look at the pattern around that as opposed to trying to figure out who's telling the truth. And also make sure that, like, if a parent is complaining, like about a kid who is high-functioning autistic, when I would talk to even my FFT colleagues about my son and my frustrations with him, so often they would say things like, oh, he just wants your attention. Well, okay, I know that. That doesn't help me. It blames me. If I was a better mom, I could find a way to give them attention. What you have to do is not just give those kind of platitudes, but when somebody said to me, oh my God, that has to be so frustrating, especially when you understand that this is normal, but it just doesn't make it any easier to deal with. So even parents who have a good understanding of the diagnosis need some affirmation that things can be frustrating, they can be tiring, and it can be really, really difficult to parent a child with any kind of special needs. All right. Remember, the relational assessment is just as important with families where there's mental health issues as it is in any family. Really looking at the behaviors around the depression. For example, a mom who is depressed, who in some ways her depression gets her contact with her family. Other moms, the depression may get her autonomy. So you have to look at what are the behaviors that the parent does and what basic function do they get out of those behaviors. So in the case example we've been using, the behavior pattern was there was this kind of undercurrent of waiting for something to happen. So Dad leaves his phone at home when he had previously agreed to go shopping for the family. Mom takes this as he didn't want to go shopping and is preventing her from sending him the list. So when he gets home, she starts the fight. And one of the kids tries to make a joke. Dad verbally attacks the youth. Mom takes the youth side, and then Mom and Dad continue to fight with both kids going to their room and not coming out till the next day. And now if this fight happens, this kind of fighting happened like once a month, then that doesn't mean that the mom and dad are connected, but this type of fighting happened almost daily. And when there are good times, it tends to be with the mom and the kids doing an activity and dad on the periphery watching. So you have to take into account not just the pattern, but the frequency of when the problem occurs, and also when there's not a problem. What is the interaction between family members? So mom to dad and dad to mom, we assess as connected. Mom to kids, the behavior patterns seem to be the same with both kids, and it seemed that she was mid-pointing to the kids, so she was either really autonomous or really connected, which is kind of, once again, kind of what we would see as normal type of borderline behavior. The kids to mom were autonomous. Dad to kids was autonomous, and kids to dad was autonomous. Dad controlled the finances, but mom seemed to have more influence over the relational function. And so we decided that mom and dad were symmetrical because mom had influence over some things, dad had influence over others. So as we got the family to agree that what happened between them, there was this kind of sense of kind of misperception as opposed to people just really trying to make each other mad, and that there were things that they could do to work differently towards that, then we moved them right into behavior change. And remember, our goal of behavior change is to eliminate or reduce referral problems. Notice it doesn't say to change a diagnosis. It says to eliminate or reduce referral problems, so you have to look at the problem behaviors. Improve family interactions and build skills. And we're going to do this through being directive, through teaching, through structuring this session to teach and practice skills. And we're going to model the behavior, we're going to coach the family, we're going to give homework. And so just as in any kind of FFT, every behavior change session should have these components in it. The rationale for why you're asking them to do what you're going to ask them to do, the teaching of information, the practicing of the information, giving them feedback and coaching them around the skills and the practice, and then giving homework for them to do when you're not there. Any questions before we move into some of the ideas that are on the CSS for depression and anxiety disorders?
Not specific, I don't think. But just that idea of when a parent really has a hard time taking in what we're trying to do in terms of change meaning. We're trying to relentlessly change meaning more than they're refusing to take it in, and sometimes that energy gets pretty exhausting as a clinician, I think,
I
especially.
think also,
Go
and what
ahead.
I tend to see clinicians do when it gets to that point, or they're doing the same thing over and over. I myself have fallen into this pattern. And it's almost, that's what I was talking about, where we go to the logic part of it instead of the emotional part of it. And so I had a therapist talking to me yesterday, and their kid is on the autism spectrum. And the therapist, everything the parents were saying negative about this kid, he was trying to give them new meaning about the kid's behavior. And I said, well, whoa, hold on a minute. I don't know that they need new meaning for his behavior. I think they need your acknowledgement that it is difficult to parent this child, that it is frustrating, it is tiring, and yet they don't give up. They're in this therapy. They want to try to find different ways. But what was happening is every time he tried to give new meaning, it actually raised their negativity. And I think it was because they really didn't think he understood how bad it was or how hard it was. And so I think that's one thing we have to keep in mind. Sometimes we're going to this real logical part, and we're trying to explain the kid to the parents, and really what we need to do is focus on the parents and focus on their pain. This is not how they expected parenting to be. This is not the dream they had for their family. And just acknowledge how difficult it is. And a lot of times you'll see then they'll be right on board with the reframes and themes. As long as they understand that, or they feel like you understand that this is really, really hard for them. Any other questions around that? I think it's a really good point. All right.
Oh, yeah, and I love what you were saying, because I
Go ahead, Lori.
no, that's it.
Okay. All right. All right. So, we see a lot of depression, both parental and child. We see anxiety. We see addictions. We see anger and aggression. We see post-traumatic stress disorder. We definitely see lots of kids on the autism spectrum. And one of the things to remember is that one of the most kind of known or best practice treatments for depression and other mental health diagnoses is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's based on the premise that people with depression or other cognitive or other diagnoses, they have kind of cognitive distortions in their views of themselves, the world, and the future. And so cognitive behavioral is designed to be time limited, but it really focuses in on changing the distortions that they have and helping them kind of change the way they think. And so it's kind of this three-part system. There's feelings and emotions, there's thoughts, and then there's actions. And I mean, when I first started doing therapy eons and eons ago, I mean, one of the most popular saying was, feelings don't drive the train. Now, I'm not even really sure what that meant, but we said it all the time. But the idea being that most people try to change their feelings when it actually is better to change the thoughts, and then the feelings and emotions and the actions change when people change the way they think. And so most people try to change their emotions. They try to feel better first, but that's the hardest part. And it's much easier to teach and to learn skills to change your thoughts and actions, which then in turn changes the way you feel. And so some of the worksheets that are on the CSS is this one on emotional spirals, about how you feel affects the way you think and behave, which then just, you can either have a downward spiral of feeling unhappy and you isolate, you feel depressed, you become less active, which makes you feel more depressed and you do even less, or the upward spiral of doing some, feeling great, doing well, feeling better, having fun, feeling good, doing something successfully, and really helping people to kind of recognize the spirals and what kind of even almost triggers the spirals and help them to replace that negative thinking and behaviors with more positive thinking and more positive behaviors. There's also kind of this checklist of negative thoughts and negative thinking errors, and then ideas on how to help family members to change that. So a lot of times the kind of negative thoughts that lead to depression and anxiety disorders, and honestly, I see this with my son with the high-functioning autism, is this real negative opinion of themselves, especially because a lot of times they have such a hard time with, social skills and social interaction, a lot of self-criticism, self-blame, lots of negative interpretations of events. I mean, my son sees the absolute worst interpretation of an event there could be. Negative expectations of the future, and really just the sense of constantly being overwhelmed. Questions? Okay, you answered the one about this is on the CSS under resources. Any other questions so far, Lori?
Nope, just wanted to make sure that that was in that was under resources.
Yes, it is.
Okay, thanks.
It's under the depression and anxiety disorder module. So one of the things that you do with families where there's a family member with depression, or really, honestly, with any kind of mental health issues, is that you help them to think that negative thoughts tend to be automatic, and the thoughts are unreasonable, and they serve no useful purpose. But at the time, they're going to seem very reasonable and perfectly plausible. And that the more the person believes the negative thoughts, the more they kind of uncritically accept them, the worse they feel. Okay, that's the same slide. Why is it doing that? Okay, and so once again, typical thinking errors are exaggerating, overgeneralizing, ignoring the positive. And so one of the things on there is kind of the ABC of changing feelings, which is a functional analysis. But it's really helping people look at what is the event that happened, what were their thoughts, and what were their feelings. And most of the time, you know, especially when you see depression and anxiety disorders, they know the event and the feelings, but they don't think about the thoughts that lead to those feelings. And this is the same thing about positive and negative spirals. So the skill to kind of help people change from downward to upward is, number one, by changing action. So you help them identify and plan for doing more fun things. You may teach them social skills to help improve peer interaction, and also help them teach them effective communication and problem-solving skills. But remember, you're going to have to get really specific with the families about what is their particular communication deficit. It's not just there's more out there than I statements. There is all, you know, and under the communication module on the resources section, there's multiple handouts on teaching communication skills. But so often I hear people falling back to I statements. And that may not really be what the family struggles with. They may struggle with they're very aggressive in their communication, or they're passive aggressive, or they don't know the difference between an impact statement and direct request, so everything gets mixed up. And so really looking at what are some of those skills that really leads to problems with their family interactions and their social interactions. And you would teach skills around that. You change thoughts by helping them to stop the negative thoughts and replace those with positive thoughts. And feelings are changed by changing thoughts, changing actions, and possibly learning relaxation skills. So in this case, the therapist, the case example we've been using is the therapist really had to intervene in this pattern to change the thinking errors that led to negative communication. And so kind of changing that misperception that people had. And then teach communication skills that enable the family members to hear each other and express feelings, emotions, thoughts in a way that's assertive but not aggressive or passive. Because when they did communicate, it tended to be either extremely aggressive or extremely passive. And so what he did first is he kind of did an ABC assessment with the family. He didn't do a full-blown ABC assessment every step of it, but he really took them step by step to help them see the pattern of how when they misperceived what a person was doing, it led to negative communication, and help them then to think about thinking more positively and being able to be brief and direct, but also to to ask questions that weren't aggressive, to make impact statements, to express feeling, to make sure that if it was just simply getting the dishwasher loaded, that they were able to ask that instead of going into, oh, I'm so upset and blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. So really being able to help them kind of be more directive and thoughtful in their communication. And it did occur over several sessions, and in between, the family needed to practice the skills during the sessions, or throughout the week. They didn't always do perfectly. Some weeks they practiced more than others, but they did at least make some attempts at practicing the skills. Remember, behaviors are not going to magically change after one session. It is really important to offer coaching and feedback that can facilitate family members, coaching and feedback that is concrete, and then really facilitate family members giving each other feedback. In this particular family we're talking about, the therapist was able to get the kids to give dad feedback about why they didn't include him in more things, because they thought he didn't want to be a part of it, but they really wanted him to be a part. They just didn't want to get rejected. And man, that was like a huge eye-opener for this dad. He thought they just didn't like it. And so he was then able to talk to them about the fact that he thought they didn't like him. And so they were able to kind of do this communication, and then they were able to pull him more into some of the activities that mom and the kids tended to do together. Now, he was still more autonomous, so we weren't like trying to increase totally the frequency, but at least he felt more a part of it. Also, make sure that when you set up homework, you have them repeat it back to you. You talk about how they're going to monitor it. You talk about how they're going to report it back to you. How are they going to remind each other to do the homework? Sometimes it's really good to give one person the responsibility of making sure the homework happens, because if you just give it to everybody, nobody takes kind of control of it. And remember that if they fall back into old behaviors or a crisis occurs, it is absolutely okay to have more than one session a week in behavior change. Any questions?
Not so far.
All right. So when we move into the generalization phase, we need to remember that now it's about maintaining the individual change, the family change, and also helping to facilitate the change or to extend the change into the other systems that families are involved with. And when you're working with family members where there's a mental health issue, generally there are a lot of other people involved, whether it's school, whether it's child welfare, whether it's probation, whether it's just other mental health professionals. And this is a really good time to kind of bring all those people together and make sure everybody's kind of aware of the skills the family learned, how they're going to maintain that, and how the other systems can help them to maintain that. This also may be the time where if somebody has really resisted an evaluation or medication, it's a time to revisit it. See if perhaps now that things are going better, they might feel a little more open to it. And so it's also about linking them with other resources if they need other resources. Some of them won't. So when you plan for generalization, you have to look at what are the risk factors for this family to relapse. And so, of course, one of the ongoing kind of mental health issue would be a risk factor. But how can you help them to maintain this change? It may be about doing a relapse prevention plan. It may be about making sure that the other systems that they're involved with know how to get them back on track. It may be another family support, like somebody else in the extended family who can help them to remember to do these things. But when you figure out which goal best addresses the risk factors, then you're going to teach, link, model, or support the family in meeting that goal. And remember, you can use a theme. You may have had a theme that worked really well during motivation. You may have a totally new theme in generalization for helping the family move ahead and complete FST. You don't have to have a theme, but don't be afraid to go back to themes if you need to. So in generalizing change, we help assist the family in taking the skills they've learned amongst themselves and apply those skills to other situations. So for example, you've taught them to, let's say, problem solve with each other. Now, how do they problem solve with the mental health officials or the school or the probation officer? And then once again, this is a really good time to bring all of those people together, highlight the change for us during the pre-kind of engagement stage, and then throughout therapy to determine what the referral source is going to consider success. And then work with them to see success also is defined by the family and FST. So like in probation in particular, or child welfare, it really requires you to be aware of the sanctions or other tasks that the family has to accomplish for referral sources, and using generalization to assist the family in accomplishing some or all of the tasks. So you want to have the dialogue about what the family has to accomplish with the referral source from the time of intake. But you may not even actually address it. For example, if I have a kid on probation, who I work with in behavior change kind of on communication and problem solving, and one of the things we may talk about or we may problem solve in behavior change is around getting their community service hours done. But in generalization, we're going to be even more planful about how close are they to getting them done, helping them set up schedules if need be, helping the parents help them figure out how to get these hours completed or classes completed, whichever it may be. Helping family members think about transportation to therapy sessions, kind of all those case management tasks is what generalization is all about. But you may actually start talking about it through using some of the skills in behavior change, but then you're making sure that it occurs during generalization. Maintaining change, how do we assist the family in maintaining the changes they've made? Usually this is about relapse prevention. This is more than just talking about it, though. I a lot of times think a lot of therapists think they go in and say to the family, well, you may relapse. Okay, that's our plan. But it's really helping family members review where they've had trouble in the past and then helping them plan for how to avoid that trouble or address it earlier in the future. So helping them know what their red flags are, what are the signs that they may be falling back into old patterns of behavior, and really like throwing different scenarios at the family and having them think about and plan for how they would handle those scenarios. Supporting change, what resources does the family need to help them maintain change? It doesn't have to be all professional resources. What resources do they have in their family, their friends, their neighbors? And just remember, we link families to outside resources not because the contract says we have to, but to address a risk factor and to build upon a protective factor. So in the case example I've been using, just so you know, in generalization, at the time of the initial referral, the mom said she was not doing individual therapy, she was not having an evaluation, but at generalization, now that the focus had kind of been taken off of her being the problem, the family was functioning better, the therapist went back in and brought the idea of individual therapy or evaluation. At that point, she still refused. But the closer the therapist got to closing the case, the more willing she was to look at that. So they needed to do some continued kind of family bonding activities to continue to help repair and improve the family relationships. They also needed intervention with school officials to help them see the family in a more positive light because they actually were just really, really negative about both mom and dad. And so the therapist was getting ready to help them schedule a meeting with the school, and the family actually problem solved and got the kid into a different school, which the kid was much happier with, too. So it actually, because they were now able to communicate and problem solve, they were able to, this problem had been going on for like 2 years at school with this kid, was solved in many ways, number one, just because they were able to talk about it. And then also they had to talk about some socioeconomic issues that could be addressed. remember, a lot of our families live in bad neighborhoods. Unless we're going to move every one of them, we have to help them, learn to live safely in that neighborhood. But in this particular case, there were some programs that this family would qualify for that the therapist helped them get linked to. So in generalization, when there's mental health issues, don't make the mistake of focusing only on the diagnosis or seeing the goal as being medication compliant, okay? Or just getting them on meds, because the majority of people with mental health issues will spend a lifetime going on and off their medication. It's what the family's going to struggle with. It's what that person is going to struggle with. So don't see that as your goal. Your goal is to help them develop more natural resources as opposed to professional resources, and help them build skills that will change the way that they interact with each other and change the way they interact with the other systems in a more positive light. But it is also, once again, extremely important to make sure referral sources and other community agencies involved with the family are aware of the progress the family's made and the plans for the future. Okay, I'm going to stop right here to ask if there's any questions so far.
I'm going to talk for a second and see if any questions pop up. But two things that I was thinking of, I've seen a lot. One, when therapy is nearing termination, that can be a trigger for relapse, especially with something like borderline personality disorder. So that issue, and when the family member or you, it happens a lot with kids, want the family therapist to continue as the individual therapist. Those are two things I see a lot with clinicians.
Right. And I think that, like you said, Lori, this happens with all families, but it can be more kind of, I think a therapist can feel more pulled into it when there's mental health issues. Remember, as we're looking for these families with you leaving, possibly even relapsing in order to keep you in there, then you need to start talking about leaving early in the process, and you need to back out a generalization. For example, don't go every week maybe with that family and then just close. It's like go for 2 weeks and then take a week in between sessions. And then maybe take 2 weeks in between sessions. If possible, I know some of your agencies don't allow this, but if possible, kind of back out more slowly with those families and get them used to the idea that they can do this on their own. Also making sure that they feel like that they have a place to call if they just need to vent. I mean, in my agency, it was fine for them to call us. So we always said, you can always call if you just want to talk through something, if you want to check something out, if you just have a question about something. And you know what? 99% of the families never called. But at least they knew that they could. Now, as far as continuing on as the individual therapist, I think that the real struggle there is that, basically you're not going to be able to go back in as a family therapist because now you're going to have more of an alliance with that person that you have on an individual therapy basis. I also think that it also, in some ways, it kind of perpetuates the thought that their change is about us and not about them. And one of the things we want to do in generalization is make sure that they understand that they made the changes. It's not us magically coming to their house that made the changes. We're not that good. They still had to do the work.
Perfect.
Any
and
other?
No more questions popped up.
Gosh, did everybody go to sleep?
I think you're just doing such a fabulous job that they don't have any questions.
You are so FFT.
I learned from the best.
I think also remembering that booster sessions can be utilized in FFT, and there's two different types of booster sessions that can be utilized. Number one, booster sessions are only done for families who have successfully completed FFT. Now, sometimes there are planned events. Okay, so situations where, as a therapist, you're aware that treatment's ending, but that there's something coming up in the future that may present a risk for sustaining the change. So let's say a lot of times I know we don't get truancy referrals until like January, and by the time we complete with them in April, school's ending. And so it's kind of like, okay, you've made these changes, but now when school starts up next year, you want to make sure that they're able to kind of go back to that. You could actually plan to do booster sessions at the start of school. Once again, I'm telling you, FFT says you can do this. Your agency, however, may have policies, procedures, or even contract expectations that say you can't. So you must go through your supervisor with these kind of things because they're going to know your agency guidelines. Also, booster sessions can occur for unplanned events. Either the family or the referral source has uncovered some kind of disruption, and they've asked the therapist to come back in. I will tell you that when I get those calls, and they were, once again, very infrequently, but when I would get those calls, the majority of time we could do the work over the phone. It didn't necessitate going back out and seeing the family. In the times that it did, it was usually 1 or 2 sessions with the family, and you had them back on track. We also get asked a lot, is there ever any time where you would do a new course of FFT? The answer is, of course, there would be some situations. They're going to be very rare. And so you would want to talk with your supervisor, the supervisor talk with Lori or the FFT national consultant, or you know, whoever your consultant may be, talk with them because there would be, once again, they're very rare, but we wouldn't say you would never do it. It just happens very, very rarely. The other thing I can tell you about booster sessions is we have an agency in Colorado that as part of their contract, they got it written in that they contact families at 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days, and they offer booster sessions. And only 2% of families have wanted or needed booster sessions. So they are extremely rare.
Can you speak to a little bit the boundaries? Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you speak to the boundaries around, for instance, in the case that you're discussing, what the therapist did to set boundaries around booster sessions when it comes to a borderline parent? Because it's another one where lots of boundaries have to be set.
I think basically he instructed them because of the tendency. Number one, they really, really didn't want him to leave. And so he did the whole backing out slowly. It just so happened the family went on a holiday, which or vacation, for 2 weeks, and so that actually they were able to function quite well, and so that kind of led into he had a session, then took another 2 weeks, then had a session. But because we were concerned about kind of the family, both dad and mom in particular, wanting the therapist to stay involved, we actually set it up with them that if they ran into problems, they could call. But that it had to be around, they had to have tried to talk about it, they had to have an idea about a solution, and then the therapist would help them kind of if they just got stuck where there was no solution that they could come up with, and that if they wanted more sessions, they would have to go through the case manager for that. So he just really kind of spelled out what were the things that they could call about, what they had to have tried first, and then if they wanted him to come back out to the house, they had to go through the case manager to do that. And mom didn't like to ask the case manager for things, so.
That's good.
Yeah, it worked well.
I hope
one of the other things I will.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Lori.
Oh, I was just going to say, hopefully that was enough information. I think it's that, you know, coming up with creative ideas to set boundaries, and definitely use your teams and supervisors for that, because I think that was a really good question of how are we going to set boundaries from the get-go, even with sessions, but also you know, calls outside a session and booster sessions. So thanks for that question.
The other thing I want to say is that towards the end of behavior change with this family, Dad went back to really negative and blaming of Mom, and he kept bringing up the affairs again and again and again. And so we were trying to look for kind of a creative way to help Dad see where holding on to his anger was actually keeping him stuck. And so what the therapist did, and this is an old therapy technique, so any of you have been around for a long time, I did not create this, I don't know who did, but basically you have all the family members grab hold of a pillow with both hands, and then you ask them to reach out and hug each other while still holding on to the pillow. And you can't do it. You have to let go of the pillow, or you have to kind of give a half-hearted hug, or just like a one-armed hug. And so basically then you talk about that when you hold on to something like anger so tightly, it keeps you from reaching out to other people, and it keeps you from being able to care about other people in the way that you would want or in the way that they would want. And so that you have to, you may still hold the anger in one hand, or you may have to kind of set it to the side in order to really be able to reach out to people. It may still be there. But if you hold on to it really, really tightly, it keeps you from moving forward. And for whatever reason, with this particular family, that was really, really powerful for both Dad and Mom. And Dad, after that activity, he never brought the affairs up again. He still got mad at Mom, don't get me wrong, but he never brought the affairs up again. And I think it just, he realized that if he was going to stay with her, he had to get not get over it maybe, but he had to not keep that as the focus. And so there's a lot of different kind of techniques out there like that, you know, and you just kind of type it into Google and see what's out there. Like I said, that one is from like the 80s, so there's probably some new stuff out there, but I haven't found it. Okay. So families where there's a mental health issue can be some of the most challenging families that we face. And that sometimes that's due to the pressure the agency puts on us. Sometimes it's due to referral source pressures. Sometimes it's due to our own perceptions or our feelings of being helpless and hopeless. But it's essential that we maintain our FST principles and adherence to the phases of the model when working with all families, but especially those families in which other circumstances might try to pull us off task. And remember, there's no magic pill or no magic answer for working with these families. Like all FST, it takes being relentless, trying things, seeing what works, what fails, and trying again. All right, that is the end of the mental health presentation. So I want to give people a few minutes to come up with questions. Lori, do you have comments?
I do want to make sure that there were some questions early on around interventions. I wanted to highlight the depression module that we went through, but make sure that that person felt like their question got answered. The thing I really love about the depression module is it's depression and anxiety. And remember, you know, a lot of those interventions can be used for multiple, you know, people who are emotionally dysregulated, or, I mean, those are very flexible interventions. So I just wanted to point that out. There is a question about active substance abuse. Are we going to have a webinar on active substance abuse? I can't remember.
We do not have it because because of the whole contingency management piece. It's certainly something that we can put on a schedule for future webinars. I think the most important thing to remember with active substance abuse is that, number one, determining whether it is abuse, misuse, determining the kind of level of use, and how much it impacts daily life, that also what drug the kid is using or the family member's using. And so what we always recommend is what is kind of typical substance abuse treatment is to do an ABC assessment or some kind of functional analysis of the substance use, and then help identify the skills and deficits that lead to substance use or abuse. And so the idea being that, for a lot of kids it has to do with peer pressure or peer they just do what their peers do, following their peers. And so what you have to do is you have to teach peer refusal skills. You have to teach better decision-making skills. You have to teach them to identify those areas where they might be called in to use, and then how do they make different decisions about those kind of events. And helping the parents to help them do that, and helping the parents to kind of identify how they make the decisions, how they do peer refusal skills, those kind of things. If it's because lack of kind of coping or stress management techniques, then you have to teach stress management techniques to the family, and you have to help them to be able to teach the kids. If it's because the family interaction is so bad, it's the kid's only way of kind of coping with the stress, then you're focusing in on those family interactions. So the thing about substance use, like any kind of problem behavior, is you have to assess what are the skill deficits that lead to that, and then address those skill deficits.
Great, and I know substance use is bigger. It's a whole webinar or a whole training in and of itself. There is contingency management training through FFT. If you're interested in that as an agency, be sure to email Pam Hawkins. But there are some really good resources as well through the internet. Looking at motivational interviewing is to me, a really nice match with FFT in terms of looking at how to help a family member move from, pre-contemplation to at least contemplating the fact that their substance may be part of what's going on as a family. I mean, it's a huge topic. So hopefully just that quick and dirty examples of interventions could help spur some conversation around it. But certainly,
I think,
go ahead.
I think the other most important thing to remember is that SAMHSA has recognized the most effective treatment for adolescent substance use or abuse is family therapy. It's not residential treatment. It's not outpatient treatment. It's family therapy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. I think we have a tendency to want to send kids away when we get a kid who's, especially when it's methamphetamine, it's scary, and so we want to, put them somewhere and keep them safe. And just that reminder that kids who go somewhere may be safe while they're there, and they come home and go right back to using. So
exactly,
therapy is
exactly. And to keep in mind that, like I said, you also have to look at the drug the kid is taking or abusing, or even the parent, because they may need detox, and they may need a safe detox, and that is perfectly okay in FFT, to help facilitate that. But I think those cases are more rare. What we tend to see is the kid is smoking pot, whether it be daily, once a week, once a month, 2 or 3 times daily. That tends to be more of what we see. Or the entire family smoking pot together. Any questions? So if you take anything away from this, I want you to take away the idea that there is no diagnosis that rules a person out of FFT from the FFT perspective. Your agency or your contract may say differently, but from the FFT perspective. But every single case needs to be assessed, and it needs to be assessed for safety issues. There may need to be a safety plan. There may need to be more immediate linkage on certain cases than there would be on others. but that your goal is not to change the diagnosis, but to change the behaviors that surround the problem, to change the behaviors that surround the problem behaviors, change that pattern, and help the family to interact better, and then help them also to interact better in the community. And one of the reasons why we did the discussion topic on mental health issues and also divorced parents and low cognitive functioning families at Blueprint is because we really see it as some of the same basic core issues. You also have a slideshow that was presented on functional family therapy, work with divorced and separating parents. And as I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today because our next webinar is specifically on that topic. But I wanted you guys to have what was presented at Blueprint. And one of the main things, I think, is to not be afraid to bring divorced parents into a room together if part of the problem in the family is the co-parenting aspect. Now, we say that, and we also want you to keep in mind, if there's a restraining order because of domestic violence or whatever reason, that the families can't be in the same room together, then no, you don't bring them in the same room together. But you also may need to get creative. You may need to do a session with mom and kids. You may need to do a session with dad and kids separately. And so we have actually seen it work in multiple situations. We've seen bringing the divorced parents and their new spouses or paramours all together into the same room with the kid and had that be successful. I had a therapist who had a really successful case where she couldn't bring them all together because of past domestic violence. So one week she met with mom and kid, the next week she met with dad and kid, because one week kid lived with mom, one week kid lived with dad. And, you know, for that particular family and many other cases where that has occurred, that has also been successful. You have to really assess who is part of the problem, who needs to be a part of the solution, and not doing things because it's easier, but doing things that are going to be the most helpful for the family. It would be easiest to meet with whoever's the custodial parent and the kid, but that's not always going to be the most helpful.
This might not quite fit, but in separated families, if there's basically how to address the issue of molest when I'm going to say perpetrator is no longer in the home, kiddo and mom are living together, long history of molest, how to address that without that shame piece around mom, you know, or kid, or...
Well, I think that once again goes back to how they bring it up, and is it, because there's a piece of it that may just be historical, it's there, right? And some families, the kids receive treatment, moms receive treatment, everybody's okay, but every time somebody starts therapy with them, they want to talk about that. Other families, it's right out there in the forefront, okay? I think, number one, if you know it and you feel like it's a part of an issue or they allude to it being the issue, don't be afraid to put it out on the table. I know, you know, and I would say something like, I know from your referral records that there's been a past history of sexual abuse, you know, and I want you all to be aware that I know that, and if you know, let's talk about how it may still impact you or not impact you. I think you can bring it up that way. If they bring it up, I think you have to do what you do with anything. You're not trying to give new meaning to the sexual abuse. What you may need to give new meaning to is how they cope with it or how they deal with it. So we recently had an issue where mom's former paramour had sexually abused the kid, but mom and him, even though he got individual therapy, mom and him had never really talked about it. And something came up, and the kid said, yeah, I'm really mad at you because you let it happen. And so the therapist didn't, you know, try to give new meaning, but she said to mom, I think you're mad at yourself that it happened. And I think that you've been looking for ways to try to help your son, and you just don't know what to do. And she goes, that's exactly it. I didn't know it was going on. I wish I would have. And so it actually led to a really good discussion between the parent and kid about how upset he was, but he really thought that she knew about it and didn't do anything about it. And she said, I really, really did not know. And so they were able to talk about it. Whether she was telling the truth or not, once again, is not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is, can it help build their relationship by just kind of talking about that openly. And then what the therapist has to work on in behavior change is, how do they talk about these difficult subjects? Because of the abuse, they no longer talked about anything. They didn't talk about good things. They didn't talk about bad things. And so talking about how that kind of shame can keep you from talking about the bad things, but then it impacts the way they just interact daily around good things. And so she has to work with them on communication skills and that.
Perfect, especially around the idea of anger. I think that was a really good description of ways to handle that, because there is oftentimes a lot of anger.
Absolutely. And once again, I think the best thing that therapist did was not trying to say to the kid, well, your mom was in a difficult, she didn't try to explain mom to the kid. She turned to mom and said, I bet you. And she basically kind of said what she thought mom was probably thinking or feeling. And mom was able to go, yeah, that's it. But I don't know that mom could have done that on her own. And I think it would have really made the kid angry if he felt like the therapist was trying to give mom excuses.
Yes. What about family members, like parents especially, or even kids with developmental delays, assessing appropriateness?
So that was one of the things that we talked about at Blueprints, not in the symposium, but it's kind of the same thing. I think, number one, the main thing that we stressed at Blueprints was you cannot take an IQ score and determine whether a kid's appropriate or not for FFT. There are no cutoff scores in FFT for IQ. So it's not like if they're 60 or below, they can't do FFT. We want you to go in and assess, because sometimes, even though the kid, like I said, may never have that aha moment of, oh, this is why I do what I do, you still got a family that is struggling with this low cognitive functioning kid. And we can help the family figure out ways to change their behavior around that and to give them new skills to deal with it. So I think if you go in with that idea, your idea is not that this kid is just magically all of a sudden going to go, oh, okay, now I'm all right, but that we're going to help everybody to kind of cope with things differently, and we're going to teach family members to interact with that kid in a different way, teach that kid in a different way. Then I think we could have some positive impact. So it goes back to assessing, as a therapist, assessing, okay, you know, can we have some impact here? The other thing was that, and I'll try to get this out to Lori so she can get it out to everyone, or to Robin so she can get it out. There was a quote that I found basically talking about any kind of person, whether it be a kid or an adult with low cognitive functioning, that one of the things they found is that when you're talking to them about things that are familiar to them, like family, like day-to-day activities, like the very kind of basic kind of things, their brain lights up in a different way. And so it makes sense to them. It's when you try to talk in huge kind of concepts or big picture kind of thing as opposed to small day-to-day tasks is when they really struggle. And so FFT can actually be perfect for some of these kids and parents who are low cognitive functioning, because you are talking about the things that are important to them and their day-to-day interactions. But it's not about, like I said, giving them that aha moment of, oh, I do this because of this. It's giving them that aha moment, we can do something differently to change this.
Yeah, it's very helpful in terms of thinking about how do we focus more on the behavioral aspect. I think that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, does that answer the question about how we, yeah, okay, I got it. It's the same question. One of my most successful cases was with a mother who had a closed head injury when the mother was 13. So she was well aware of her cognitive delays because she had been, quote unquote, normal until she was 13. And so it was keeping everything very, very basic for this mother, helping her to develop a calendar with the kids so they could keep track of things, helping her to find ways to interact with the school because she didn't have a phone, you know, and ways to talk differently to her daughter, because the first thing out of her mouth from the first session to the last session was, you need to get this kid out of my home. But it was because she so knew that this kid was basically, how she put it, she was smarter than I am. And she was afraid she couldn't parent her. And she was actually a very good parent. She just needed a few things put in place to help her monitor and supervise better and to remember things more. And, you know, we were able to do that and then work with the kid as well, ways to remind mom, ways to talk to mom. And so we were able to have a really, really successful FFT with a very low cognitive functioning mom. Oh, my computer went away. Are there any other questions?
Okay, always a tough one. Reactive attachment disorders, or let's just say attachment issues, because that's always a tough one.
I would almost have to have something more specific because, number one, I think reactive attachment disorder is way overdiagnosed. Okay, so I think you would have to assess and you would have to see. But also I think that in some way, even if there is reactive attachment disorder, FFT is perfect because we're not trying to change functioning. We're simply trying to improve the way people interact with each other and giving them skills to do so. And so you wouldn't be trying to make that person more connected. You would help them be autonomous in a more positive way and help the family have a different view of that autonomy.
And I think one of the times that I see it most often, not reactive attachment disorder, by the way, but some level of attachment issues, are immigrant families where the parents come to California, in our case, come to California and leave the kiddos with relatives in another country, and then, you know, maybe a couple years, sometimes up to 10 years later, bring the kids here, and really trying to work through basically kind of that sense of the familyness almost is a common.
Exactly, Lori, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to say, I think that's exactly what you talk about in motivation, is how they've lost a sense of family through nobody's fault, but they had to create kind of a different form of family while they were apart from each other, and now that they're together, they haven't quite figured out how to become a family. And I think some of what you have to do then in behavior changes, you have to do some of those family bonding type exercises. And there's a family bonding module in the resources section of the CSS that gives several different ideas. And definitely look at the PowerPoint presentation on family bonding, because it gives some ideas that aren't on worksheets of different family bonding activities. And it's not about creating connections or about making a person more connected, I should say. It's about creating a sense of family.
I don't have any other questions for now. We have about 17 minutes, so.
Does anybody have any last thoughts or questions?
kind of, well, I'm going to use more FFT language in this question, but sort of almost over connecting, like a parent who's a 5 and a kid who might not be, and it might be an almost inappropriate, way of connecting, such as bathing a 15-year-old.
I think that number one, you're always trying to move a person from the negative way of being connected, whether it's through kind of lack of boundaries or whether it's through the kind of constant nagging, arguing type thing, or whether it's through just, like I said, inappropriate boundaries. You're always trying to teach them skills that will have them be connected in a more positive way. And so one of the things you may have to do is talk about what is appropriate, kind of what is socially, developmentally appropriate kind of behaviors at different ages. And, a lot of parents don't necessarily know that, or they, they kind of, because they're so connected, they just overlook some things that they know may not quite be appropriate. Once again, of course, if you think there's any kind of abuse, like sexual abuse or anything going on, that's a reportable thing. That's mandated reporting. But I do think that there's lots of boundary issues out there that sometimes we simply have to address by helping them to think about what kind of are the socially appropriate norms.
Perfect. Thank you.
We have a kid right now in Florida. His mom has cerebral palsy and is in a wheelchair, and he is the primary one responsible for bathing her, helping her with the bathroom and things like that. Now, for all of us, that just seems very uncomfortable for a 15-year-old boy. So we're really having to kind of look at what is appropriate, but also that it may not bother him as much because it's always been him and her. But we're really struggling kind of to figure out, we're trying to see if we can get her other help in there so that all of that wouldn't fall on him. But the reality is they're always going to be more connected because she relies on him so much. But it definitely, there are some things that border on inappropriate for us that we're concerned about.
And I think that speaks to the cultural piece as well, where you have to look at culturally what might make sense for them that isn't going to necessarily make sense for me, as exactly. in the way I grew up. So I like that. The question came up around hearing voices and et cetera, where sometimes it's ideological. I'm not quite sure, but I think that culturally, sometimes some cultures, that's a little more normal than others. So I think that's an important thing to take into consideration. Again, that cultural piece of what behaviors may be more inappropriate or less inappropriate based on culture.
I agree, and the whole auditory hallucinations is another one that all of a sudden there seemed to be this spike in kids we were getting referred with auditory hallucinations. Now, whether that's just because there was some, and this is all over the country, guys, this isn't just California. I don't know if there was a recent paper on it or whatever. But, I mean, all of a sudden, we were getting all these kids all over who were being referred with this. I think the main thing is, number one, finding out, asking more questions, looking at things like culture, looking at the cognitive level of functioning of the kid. So, like my son, who's high-functioning autistic, when he was about 16, he came to me and he told me he was hearing voices. And, of course, my first thought as a clinician is like, oh, my God, we're in the first place of schizophrenia, right? And then I started talking to him more about it. What I realized is it was really what the rest of us would call our conscience. That kind of like devil angel side that tells us, oh, you shouldn't do this or you should do that. But to him, it was more of a voice. And so when I talked to him more and I got him to describe it more, I was able to explain to him that was a very normal, and that as long as those voices weren't telling him to hurt somebody, they were probably good voices. But I think those are the kind of things you have to check out, because there's not only cultural, but there's like religious backgrounds where the kind of voices would be almost the norm as opposed to something that would be a psychiatric disorder. On the other hand, I had a parent that I worked with who, when I went and talked to her, I was referred for this kid's sister, but when I walked up, the 17-year-old, almost 18, was kind of on the porch, kind of rocking back and forth, talking to himself. And as I got to know the family and I talked to Mom about it, she's like, yes, he hears the angels all the time. And I'm like, you know, what do you mean? And she said, yeah, he says he hears angels all the time talking to him. Well, you know, for Mom, like I said, it was more kind of a religious thing. And I said, Mom, are there any other behaviors that he does that worry you? So she started talking about the behaviors that worried her, and I was like, okay. So we helped her to get him diagnosed and get him on medication, because he was in the first break of schizophrenia, is what it was. And so his behavior was, there were several concerning behaviors, but she had not recognized it as a mental health issue.
I'm glad we're able to look at both ends of that, because that you brought up both ends of that, because I think there's the culturally almost norm or expectation that you're going to talk to spirits, you're going to talk to your dead ancestors, and that isn't problematic, but looking at, is there concerning behaviors where it may lead to something that's clinically problematic? And that's a good example of where it was the hearing voices was fine in this family culture, but it actually was something bigger than just talking to angels, because he had other clinically relevant behaviors. So thank you for clarifying that. It was helpful.
Yeah, and that was the real thing. I mean, because I at first I thought, okay, all right, you know, because this was a mom. She had 9 children, and she actually was a better parent as far as being on top of her kids and where they were and what they were doing than I was as 2 children. So, I mean, I was impressed with this mom. But when she started talking about her concerns with this kid, now because she monitored and supervised so well, he hadn't come to the attention of anyone. She had been able to kind of keep him out of getting in trouble and things like that. But she was concerned because he just kept shutting down more and more socially and things like that. So it was those behaviors that led to us getting him evaluated. She was real funny when she found out the diagnosis. She said, see, and all this time I just thought he was specially slow.
What a great mom. That's wonderful. It never was negative. Yeah. That's nice. Okay, we have just a couple minutes. I want to make sure if there's anything else we need to make sure to touch base on in terms of the mental health stuff. Some really great examples and conversations, so thank you guys.
Thank you, everybody. Once again, if you ever have ideas for a webinar, please send them to Pam Hawkins at CIMH or send them to Lori, because we really do take your all's feedback into account when we schedule these webinars. And so the next one will focus entirely on working with divorced and separated families.
Always a good topic. And just so people know, this webinar was recorded, like Kim stated, and Robin will get it on to the CIMH website, and I believe, I'm totally going to just put this on Robin, that we will get a link to that and hopefully send it out to all the FFT sites once it's uploaded on to the CIMH website. So you will all agencies will get the link.
Yeah, we can do that, Lori. It'll probably take a couple of weeks to get it set up. I don't want anyone to be looking for it too soon. Also, if anyone wants CEUs for this webinar, you can email me and we'll get a packet sent out to you. My email is on the chat box.
Awesome.
All right, then.
Did everybody get Robin's email in case, or me, or Pam Hawkins? Just email one of us and we will get that email to Robin. I totally forgot about CEUs, so thank you, Robin, for bringing that up. Great.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim.
Bye.
Bye.